Every so often, I enjoy dipping into the Elizabethan theologian Richard Hooker's Of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, a labyrinthine work which arguably is the culmination of Tudor prose. C.S. Lewis would certainly describe it in that way in his excellent overview of English literature of the 16th century. And it's a fascinating work that seeks to counter the challenges that the Church of England faced from Puritanism, from those like Thomas Cartwright, who argued that whilst the Church of England had broken away from Rome, from the Catholic Church in important ways, it was still not sufficiently reformed. It still retained too many vestiges of the Roman Church, such as the episcopacy, bishops, archbishops, the monarch as the head of the church, vestments, special clothes for the priests, gold, liturgical forms even. And of course some, like the Anabaptists, argued that infant baptism was also an unbiblical doctrine that should be jettisoned for any church to be truly reformed. And Hooker's response to this challenge is fascinating to me, not because I necessarily agree with him or want to endorse his project or outlook, but for the real hermeneutical difficulties, issues, talking points that he brings up, and I think explores in fascinating ways that I don't think anyone else was expressing at the time. His general way of arguing against the Puritans, as we might call them, is to argue against their biblicism. He wanted to affirm that Scripture was the source of the Church's teachings and necessary for salvation, but he denied that it was the only source of good teaching, of wisdom, of instruction for issues like church government. And he achieved this by a strong appeal to reason, to natural reason, to how he believed God revealed truths through mankind's use of reason, even prior to any knowledge of Scripture whatsoever. And all of this is obviously a big justification for the status quo, for the Elizabethan settlement, for the maintenance of the Church of England as the state church, for it continuing to be this sort of odd mongrel of Catholic elements, of Reformed elements. And to that extent, we might have many questions for Hooker, which I'll get onto later. But I think his desire to defend this settlement leads him to place such a strong emphasis on reason. For in the opening book, the first book of the work, he almost rarely quotes Scripture itself, as his Puritan foes might do, but he almost argues for a sort of common sense view of reason, that, well, obviously mankind's reason, whether Christian or not, obviously leads us to do good things, to order society in a right way to the benefit of its members. That's just on the face of it obvious. So what he's keen to do is to not go along with a certain Calvinist line of reasoning that would posit creation and mankind as so irredeemably fallen, so totally corrupt, that we can't really trust our normal use of reason. We might be deceiving ourselves. We have to look to Scripture to get the true wisdom, or so they would say. So for Hooker, to counter this, to counter a kind of biblicism that would say, well, only if something is explicitly in Scripture should we actually do it, and hence bishops, infant baptism should be thrown out. To counter this, he has to start by endorsing a very immanent and clear nature of reason, of natural law, which arguably leads him to extremely optimistic conclusions, to a very muted teaching of any idea of sin distorting our knowledge. The opening book is quite amazingly cheerful and optimistic on these matters, but it seems to me it has to be so if he is to then make moves such as saying, well, okay, bishops, the episcopacy isn't exactly taught in Scripture, but it works. We can trust that God has led developing churches, developing societies into not only developing this form of church government, which could be different. He says Presbyterian church governments might be right in a different time and place, like in Calvin's Geneva. But he's saying, but we can trust that God has providentially led our society, England's society, into developing this structure as the most practical and reasonable approach to ordering the church. And it's an interesting line of argument that seeks to undercut his Puritan foes entirely. And it raises all kinds of difficult questions, such as how you would know a pragmatic move is truly of God or not. He would challenge his opponents by saying, well, can you prove for certain that your use of Scripture is correct? Well, if not, why are you disrupting what we can trust is God's providential work? That sword can cut more than one way, of course. But he is remarkably modern almost in emphasizing the role of the interpreter, the interpreter's mind, and in questioning his opponent's claim to be teaching just what Scripture teaches. So in the preface, he says something along the lines of, it's like Pythagoras and his school, who they glommed onto the idea of numbers being the true reality behind all we perceive, and then would go and see everything by that light, even if it was absurd. And he would say the same of his Puritan opponents, that actually they're not just seeing what Scripture says, they've got an idea in mind already from somewhere, and then they're seeing everything through that lens. And I think this is still pertinent today when many conservative evangelicals, I think, have unquestioned philosophical approaches to the Bible, which you could call maybe a sort of empiricism, the sort of idea that the meaning of the text is in there, and just with the right exegetical and hermeneutical tools, one can extract it almost objectively. Lip service might be given to, well, we're all in a different time and place and that affects our reading, but for practical purposes, that's never seen as having too strong a power of determination or upsetting this idea that with the right objective tools, you can get the right meaning from the Bible. And I think Hooker's project does problematize this, even as we might question his purposes as a whole. For the difficulty with what he's doing is that he's not affirming something similar to the Catholic Church, who would justify the episcopacy by saying, well, you need the supernatural gift handed down from the original apostles to make the sacraments work, and if a bishop is not in that line, then we can't know that God's grace is at work through them in that way. He's not arguing in that way. His argument is pragmatic. Like I said, he's saying there could be times and places where bishops aren't necessary or the wise choice. But then this does open the question of how far is all of Christianity, all Christian doctrines, pragmatically used concepts for particular societies? Is there not a danger that his approach could demystify Christianity altogether? And these questions perhaps lead on to the work of Thomas Hobbes, the Civil War era writer whose Leviathan is one of the most significant works of political philosophy in the English language. Hobbes, as an absolutist, unlike Hooker, who was something of a constitutional monarchist who believed the monarch was still under the law, still more the expression of the church, the nation's laws than anything else. Unlike that, Hobbes believed that any approach similar to that would lead to chaos, factions, differences of opinion that would create the grounds for a civil war, such as the one he lived through. So for Hobbes, there has to be an absolute leader. Maybe a parliament, he does say that could be possible, but generally he's talking about an absolute authority who can lay down exactly what people should do and profess to believe, including in matters of religion. So for Hobbes, the only reason the Bible has authority is because the Emperor Constantine proclaimed what it was and what books should be in it through his stamp of approval on the Ecumenical Council. And for Hobbes, unless this happens, there's just no solution to the problem of keeping a unified nation that will not fall apart. And there's a famous debate over whether Hobbes was actually an atheist and did really see all religion merely as an expression of social purposes of power. And I'm not sure if that debate has much meaning, as I've discussed with the question of whether John Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. Maybe we need to not really think about the individual's motives or intention as such, but the context he was within and what that was shaping, even in contradictory ways within his work. But to my mind, there's a fascinating progression that can go from the work of Hooker, of his hermeneutical problems, to the work of Hobbes. And it's interesting then to compare it to John Milton, his ideal of a tolerant society, not for Catholics, but for Protestant diversity, which, ultimately did not prove to be the way forward, as Oliver Cromwell, exhausted with the differing demands of different Protestant sects, had to declare himself to be Lord Protector and to take a more authoritarian turn. But in the long run, to bring things maybe nearer the modern era, you could say these problems in some ways were solved by a kind of liberalism that allowed a diversity of beliefs, but as long as it was structured by the emerging capitalist market and system. And I think in many ways you could say that this is what we've been stuck with. Our society is unified in an impersonal way by forces beyond our individual beliefs. Our individual beliefs, whatever they may be, are almost an interest, a hobby. We can go to our interest group and it's not going to disrupt the workings of capital. It's going to serve certain social purposes for a certain class fraction or fractions without disrupting the ongoing shaping power of capital. And as we approach an era where global capital seems very fragile, what effect will that have on the forms religion takes, on the uses religion has? There's very dangerous ways religion is being used currently, will it have a use in a more healthy way, as I would see it, perhaps? But that remains to be seen. In the meantime, I think we can delve back into these fascinating thinkers who are part of the story of how we've come to be the people we are in the West now, and ponder what might be next.